The wind swept across the endless Kansas prairie, dry and sharp, stinging Eleanor Whitmore's face as she stood beside the broken wagon. The wheel had cracked days ago, and her in-laws hadn't bothered to help repair it. Now they were gone, driven by bitterness, superstition, and a callous desire to cut their losses. "You brought death to my son," her mother-in-law had spat before climbing into the wagon. "The rest is on your own head." They hadn't even looked back. Just the creak of wheels and the flapping of canvas as the train rolled away, leaving Eleanor, her 6-year-old daughter Clara, and 4-year-old Tommy in the growing silence. Eleanor stood motionless for several minutes, clutching the frayed handle of the burlap sack that held what little food they'd been permitted to keep. Her hands trembled, though from cold or rage, she couldn't say. The children watched her, confused but trusting. Clara held Tommy's hand tightly, eyes searching their mother's face for reassurance. Eleanor forced a small smile, though her throat ached with the effort. "We'll be all right," she whispered, more to herself than them. The sod house, half-built, loomed nearby. Her husband, Jonathan, had started it before the fever took him in the spring. It was little more than a dugout in the earth with packed sod walls and a patchy thatch roof. No door, no stove, just a drafty pile of ambition and grief. Eleanor worked until her hands bled, dragging wood and stone, patching what she could. The nights were cold even in late summer. She curled her children close to her beneath a horse blanket salvaged from the wagon, listening to their thin breathing and trying not to cry when they coughed. She fed them what she could: wild onions, leftover beans, a stale biscuit split 3 ways. She took the rusted rifle down from the wagon box and checked the single remaining round. Not for hunting. It was too precious. It was for if things went too far wrong. For the children first, then herself. Eleanor stared at the gun for a long time one night, her cheeks slick with tears she wouldn't allow during the day. "I won't let them suffer," she said aloud, her voice shaking in the dark. The wind was merciless, howling over the prairie, carrying dust into their shelter and whistling through the cracks. It reminded her how small she was out here, how alone. And yet, each morning she rose before the sun, fed her children, and started again. There was no one else. There was only her. And still, deep within her, beneath the grief and fury and exhaustion, something remained. A flicker. Not hope, not yet. But a refusal to die. Eleanor awoke to a silence that felt strange. The wind had stilled overnight, leaving a quiet that pressed against her ears like a held breath. She stepped outside the sod house, wrapping a ragged shawl around her shoulders, her eyes scanning the pale horizon. The prairie, usually so restless, lay still beneath a sheet of early morning fog. The mule brayed softly in the distance, but something else tugged at her attention. A dark shape stood atop a ridge about 200 yards away. Her heart seized. The figure was on horseback, unmoving, outlined faintly against the sky. It was too distant to see clearly, but the rider's shape was unmistakable, tall, upright, draped in a long blanket or robe. Panic surged through her. Could it be one of the in-laws come back? No. They would have shouted, come barging in. This was different. Still, watchful, her hands fumbled for the rifle leaning against the sod wall. She didn't want to touch it, but she had no choice. The children were still asleep inside, curled up together. She stepped to the edge of the dugout and raised the barrel slightly, squinting toward the ridge. The figure didn't move. She waited. 10 minutes. Then 20. Her arms grew tired. The fog began to lift, revealing more of the open grassland, but by then, the rider was gone. Eleanor lowered the rifle slowly, a sick feeling in her gut. She didn't know if she had just been spared, or marked. The next morning, he was there again. Closer this time, not menacing, just present. She didn't raise the gun this time. They stared at each other across the stillness until the children woke and called for her. When she turned back, the ridge was empty. The following day, something changed. Eleanor stepped out to find a bundle of meat lying near the sod house. Wrapped in bark and sinew, still warm. She dropped to her knees beside it, heart pounding. Rabbit, cleanly skinned, dressed. Whoever had left it knew what they were doing. She looked out at the horizon, her eyes darting for movement. Nothing. The children watched from the doorway, hungry but unsure. Eleanor said nothing, only cooked the meat over the fire. They ate until their bellies ached. The next morning, there was firewood stacked beside the dugout wall, bundled tight with strips of hide. Another day, dried berries in a pouch of stitched hide, and a small wooden carving of a bird resting on top. Clara clutched it instantly, whispering that it was a gift from the wind. Eleanor's suspicion warred with confusion. Who would do this? And why? But then came the fever. It started with a chill in her bones, then the burning. Her limbs grew heavy, her thoughts thick. She tried to stir the fire and nearly collapsed into the ash. She dragged herself to the bed, shaking. Clara laid a cool cloth on her head, whispering, "Mama, it's all right. The wind man will help us." Eleanor tried to stay awake, to listen for danger, but the world tilted sideways and fell away into darkness. She didn't hear the door open. She didn't see the figure step quietly into their home, kneel beside the fire, and unwrap a pouch filled with herbs and roots. He worked silently, carefully, grinding, steeping, feeding her sips of bitter medicine. Clara watched from the corner, Tommy in her lap, neither crying nor afraid. They had been waiting for him. When Eleanor opened her eyes again, the fire was burning steady and bright. The ache in her body had dulled to a heavy throb instead of a roaring fever. Her throat still burned, and her limbs felt like lead, but she could move. A damp cloth rested on her forehead. She blinked at the ceiling of the sod house, its patched roof of grass and brush swaying gently in the breeze that crept through the seams. The sharp, earthy smell of roots and boiled bark clung to the air. She turned her head slightly, and froze. The Cheyenne man was sitting cross-legged near the hearth, feeding kindling into the fire. His profile was calm, composed. His long black hair was tied with strips of leather, and his clothes, buckskin and fur, were worn but carefully maintained. His hands moved with quiet precision, folding something in a piece of cloth. Eleanor tried to sit up, and the blanket slipped from her shoulder. Instantly, he turned. His eyes met hers, not cold, not threatening, but measured, like a man who had seen many things and expected little in return. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice cracked dry in her throat. He reached beside him, lifted a carved wooden bowl, and passed it to her. "Drink." His English was rough, but clear. She took it with shaking hands. The liquid inside was bitter, full of unfamiliar spices and roots, but it soothed her parched throat. As she drank, she caught glimpses, her children huddled in the far corner, eyes wide but calm. Clara held Tommy's hand tightly, her little face pale but not afraid. He had been here a while. Eleanor set the bowl down with trembling fingers. "You helped me," she rasped. He nodded. "You were hot, sick." "Why?" she whispered, struggling to keep her gaze steady. The man studied her face. "You have little ones. No tribe. No man. Winter comes." He shrugged gently, as if that explained everything. She didn't know what to say. Everything she'd heard. Stories whispered around campfires, warnings spat from the mouths of old men. None of it matched this quiet presence kneeling by her hearth, tending her fire. "I am Tamahase," he said. She blinked, repeating it softly, "Tamahase." He gave a small nod of acknowledgement, then gestured toward the corner of the sod house where he had laid out several bundles. More herbs, dried meat, firewood wrapped in hide, and a small, hand-woven pouch that looked like it held dried corn or beans. Clara stepped forward timidly, holding out the bird carving he had left days before. "Did you make this?" He looked at her and smiled, just faintly. "For you." Clara's face lit up. "Thank you." Tommy came forward next, not speaking, just staring up at him with big eyes. Tamahase reached into his satchel and pulled out another small carving, a tiny horse, and handed it to the boy without a word. Tommy took it like it was gold, clutching it to his chest. Eleanor watched, her heart aching in a way she hadn't expected. Not with fear, but with something else. Gratitude. Tamahase moved through the small sod house quietly over the next days. He came and went like the wind, sometimes gone by morning, sometimes already there before the sun rose. He patched the roof, showing Clara how to weave grass tighter so the rain wouldn't leak through. He cleaned out the dead brush from around the dugout and built a makeshift shelter for the mule. One evening, he brought rabbit snares and showed Eleanor how to set them near the brush line. She had her strength back enough to kneel beside him. He didn't speak unless necessary, but when he did, his voice was low, respectful. He never overstepped, never asked questions. He simply helped, and for the first time in months, Eleanor no longer felt alone. The prairie had changed. What had once been a cruel, wind-scoured emptiness was now alive with color and promise. Spring had come at last. Green shoots pushed up through the dark soil. Wildflowers bloomed in small bursts of violet and gold. The wind still moved across the land, but it no longer howled. It whispered. Eleanor stood just outside the sod house, her hands dusted with flour, the sleeves of her dress rolled to the elbows. The chimney they had built, just a stack of stones mortared with clay and willpower, smoked gently behind her. Inside, bread baked over coals and beans simmered in a pot. Laughter rang out across the grass. She turned and shielded her eyes. Clara and Tommy were running full tilt through the meadow, chasing each other with sticks. Their cheeks were ruddy with sun, their clothes patched but clean. Not far behind them, Tomahase walked alongside the old mule, guiding it carefully as Tommy rode bareback for the first time. "Hold tight," he called, his accent thick but his voice warm. Tommy whooped and bounced awkwardly on the mule's back, grinning from ear to ear. Clara cheered. Eleanor couldn't help the laugh that escaped her lips. The sound startled her. She hadn't laughed, really laughed, in months. She stepped forward, hands on her hips, as Tomahase brought the mule to a stop. He lifted Tommy down gently and set him on the ground. The boy wrapped his arms around the warrior's leg in a quick, impulsive hug before running off after his sister again. Tomahase watched them go with quiet eyes. Then he turned to Eleanor. "He is strong," he said. "He's stubborn," she replied, smiling. "Takes after his father. But the strength," her voice softened. "That might be from you." They stood in silence for a moment. The kind that didn't need to be filled. She looked up at him. In the beginning, she had measured his every movement for threat. Now she read kindness in the set of his shoulders, patience in his quiet. "Why did you help us?" she asked, not for the first time. He considered her question, then spoke slowly. "My mother was left alone, like you. When I was small, my people helped her. It is our way. We do not forget." Eleanor nodded, understanding more than his words could say. She looked toward the sod house. It was still humble, still rough. But it was home now. "You've given us more than help," she said, voice low. "You gave us a second chance." He looked at her. Not just her, but the woman she had become. Leaner, stronger, worn but unbroken. His gaze was steady, and he stepped a little closer. "Family is not only by blood," he said again, repeating what he had told her in the early days of her fever. Eleanor swallowed. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. His hand met hers, calloused, warm, steady. No promises were spoken. None needed to be. The children's laughter echoed over the hills as the two of them stood together, framed by earth and sky. Ahead of them, the land stretched wide and waiting. Harsh, beautiful, endless. And for the first time in a long while, Eleanor was no longer afraid of what lay ahead.